I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, October the 19th, 1918. I had a very sickly childhood and came to believe in my first consciousness that there was a definitive power that was carrying me through these things, because time and again the medical community said, he's gone. So having survived, my first victories were when I was 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. I did fall out of a 2-story window when I was about 13 months old. The screen was left open and I fell from a duplex window into a garden. And they tell me that I severely injured my left leg, broke it, as a matter of fact, near the knee. And this is important because 3 or 4 years, 5 years later, I began to contract what they thought was polio. Nobody knows to this day, but they called it infantile paralysis in those days. And again, I had the feeling that if I was going to get out of this pain and this discomfort, that it was going to have to come from outside the agencies that were very near me, like my father and my mother and the doctor. And it was winter, and winter in Minnesota is a good time to lie down and hibernate, and that's what I was doing. But in the spring, I began to hear the baseball played in the churchyard, catty-corner to our duplex, and I really wanted to get out of bed. And the miracle was that a Dr. Pierce, believe it or not, that was his name. Dr. Pierce entered the room and saw my disquiet and said, "Get out of bed." And I did. And he said, "Walk over here to me." And I was unable to walk at that time. And I lurched a couple of times and fell down, and he started me over and started me over. Finally, I made it from the bed to Dr. Pierce's arms. And he said, "We're on the road to recovery," he told my mother. Minnesota had 8 months of winter, and winter was very dismal in many respects, but the children used to love to play in the snow. And this is kind of a celebration of some things that I did in that snow country. Cold is lonely on the farm roads, and wide is silent on the fields, and deep is very hush. In the 5:30 purple snowfall, a boy runs wild toward the city edge, fighting for himself. He remembers one slow motion jump when he never came down, because the up was suspended, locked in time against the cold and the wide, silent, deep hush in the purple snow. Panting steam trails on his way home, alone, to dinner, and yellow light, and loud voices, and hot beef, and rattling plates, and banging pots, and hurry, 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 hurry. It seems that my grandmother and grandfather, not knowing each other, grew up in a portion of White Russia. And they finally immigrated from there to Lithuania, which was still part of Russia, but it was on the Baltic. And the Lithuanian Jewish people were called the Litvaks, or the folks of Lithuania. This is in 1888 or 89. My grandfather was 22 and my grandmother was about 17. And they sort of had a casual acquaintance in wherever it was they were living in Lithuania. Probably a semi-ghetto situation, because the Russians were very anti-Semitic. And they got on a boat, which is remarkably brave of these people to have done, tremendous courage. When they got off at Ellis Island, it seems that there are 13 ways to spell Segal. And there evidently was a standard, but when they responded to the questions at Ellis Island, the people who took down their names spelled it every which way. Now there are 13 ways to spell it, but we all say that we are related, Russian-born, and mainly brought up in Lithuania or the eastern part of Poland and so forth. There had been an influx of the Russian and Lithuanian Jewish people 10 years previous, and what they had done was to seek the same weather, seek the same landscape. Minneapolis is on 6 inland lakes, and they lived on the Baltic. On the Baltic, they had experienced 8-month winters and 4-month summers. So I think they were attracted geographically, first of all. That's how they got. They had landed, and you have to have certain sponsors. And their sponsors were in Minnesota. And they landed, and you have to have a certain amount of money to be able to take the public transportation to the place where your sponsor is. And somewhere along the line, my great-grandfather had to get off the train, and he walked across Canada. Something like 800 or 900 miles. And God knows how he survived or what he lived on, and he couldn't speak a word of English, and no French in the French province, and so forth. And he walked across Ontario, got down to the northern part of Minnesota, and walked down to Minneapolis. Already my grandfather and grandmother were there, and they greeted him, of course, with open arms. And they were married in Minneapolis in 1892. And my great-grandfather walked a square in Minneapolis and said, and this will be where the temple is, because this was his ancient Orthodox tradition. And my grandfather became wealthy and built the first synagogue in Minneapolis in that particular area. So that was a matter of family triumph, as it were. The story is that my grandfather found a stove rusted and thrown away in a dump. And he took the stove and restored it, shellacked it in black, and made it a brand new stove. Then he didn't know how to transport it, so he went to some bank or some Jewish lender, and he borrowed just enough money to get a cart. Then he mortgaged the cart and the stove and bought a horse. And he took the horse and he went out in the country with more than just the stove, and he sold to the Swedish farmers whatever he could pick up. You know, a junk man. And eventually this wrote itself into this little empire that he built that I'm still fascinated by. And all my uncles followed him, except my father was the renegade. My mother was an incredibly good musician. She was a pianist who had learned piano by herself, but had somehow gained the capability of reading music and transposing on sight, which we know is a very difficult thing to do. But she did it easily. And her professional name was Gertrude Stone, and the incoming stars, men and women who were doing the Orpheum circuit, like Baby Snooks and Ruth Edding and Helen Morgan and all the singers of her time, would say, "Get me Gertie Stone." She played in a theater where Duke Ellington came in 1930. He had formed his first band in Washington, D.C. in 1929. And here the band is on the road. And my mother said to me, "You're going to go with me to the theater and listen to the greatest orchestra you ever heard in your life." I listened to Duke Ellington in 1930. I was 11 years old, and I was aghast. Cacophony. I mean, there was discord in the orchestra. There were wild and wonderful things happening, and the soloists drove me crazy with their inventions. And my mother was going, you see? In other words, I was responsive. And I remember that every band that came through and every artist that came through Minneapolis would say, get me Gertie Stone. My mother had a Steinway bench that was just filled with music. And she could play anything. And at the drop of a hat, you didn't have to ask her really. She was playing music all the time. So by some kind of wonderful osmosis, the beauty and the gaiety and the force of music began to take place with me. So I started to sing with her, which she encouraged tremendously. And finally, she put me in kiddie reviews. I used to go out and sing, smile, darn you, smile, or, one of those. And I broke it up because, who was this little kid? I could barely speak English, and I'm singing songs, and funny songs. And you can't walk back from an aeroplane, so what are you girls gonna do? All you future lucky Lindies want a little bit of squeezing. A girl who has good sense, she'll have to listen to reason, 'cause there's air. My mother used to sing those songs, and I learned them verbatim. She'd take me to the B'nai B'rith, or the Catholic Nurses Association, or the Red Cross when they had reviews, and for charity, we would do a mother-son deal. And she would open for me, and I was the big star. So I was terribly nervous. I always thought I was going to lose the lyric. But I'm told that I never clammed it up. And the applause was universal, and I became known as Little Jackie Segal in Minneapolis. When Fern came along, they brought her into the living room of my grandmother's and grandfather's house, and for some reason, I felt a total rejection because the entire family went to my sister, the new infant, and I was neglected for a short time. And of course, I resented my sister, which made for a very bad sibling relationship in the early years. I adore my sister now, and she adores me, and we've gotten over the conflict because I did become my mother's pet, and she sort of neglected my sister. And my father was not a very responsive person. He was actually very cold and uninvolved. And so he didn't give my sister much either. So my sister grew up, and how she ever triumphed over all that, I don't know. My father was a star athlete. He was a glorious, glorious human being. He was a physical specimen. He was about 5'8½", weighed 175 pounds, ran the 100-yard dash in just over 10 flat, and we're talking at the turn of the century with a football suit on. And he starred for North High in Minneapolis as a football player. And when he used to take me by the hand to the cigar store on Fifth Avenue or any of the places in Minneapolis, they used to say, "Are you Jack's son?" And I'd say, "Yeah." "Are you going to be a football player?" And I learned to answer by saying, "I don't think I can pass the physical." And my father was very warmly appreciated in Minneapolis because it was a sports center. Long before professional football became the thing, my dad took me to the Minneapolis Yellow Jackets and to the Green Bay Packers before there was a National Football League. And I saw the beginning of that. And he was a friend, my father, of a sponsor from Yale, Pudge Heffelfinger. And you could look it up, as Arthur Godfrey says. Pudge Heffelfinger became Minneapolis's first All-American football player at Yale. And he came to my father's high school and he said, I want you to go to Yale, buckle down so that you can get your grades and so forth. And my grandfather jerked my dad out of school. And my dad didn't even finish his football career at North High. But he knew all these guys. He knew Pudge Heffelfinger. He knew Walter Eckersall from Chicago. He knew all the All-Americans. And when my dad showed up at a Sandlot football game, the guys would come over and shake his hand. How are you, Jack? And I was very proud of my dad, you know. He used to get maybe $5 for playing during the week and $10 on a weekend to play semi-pro football. And my dad was already in his late 20s and early 30s before my mother made him quit. And I was born when my dad was 26, so you can kind of get the picture. I was 4 and 5 years old when my dad stopped being an athlete and became a real bum who couldn't earn a living. In the meantime, my grandfather was laying down a financial empire. He had a furniture store, he had a building and loan, and he had a lumber company. And my father eschewed going to work at any of them. He was a bum, a wonderful bum. So my mother was playing in theaters and earning the money in the family. So unfortunately, we had to move. Every time a lease was up, my father and mother took me from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, and I had to go through another school. I went to 7 schools in 9 years. I got the idea that we couldn't pay the rent, and we were getting kicked out. And what happened was my grandfather, by this time, owned a number of multiple dwellings, apartment buildings. And we moved from my father's and mother's capability of paying for rent to these various apartment buildings where we were sort of rent-free, although my grandfather was something of a curmudgeon and told my dad to pay a certain amount every month. This was ruled over by a very strict Uncle Julius, who was manager of the various real estate properties. And he restricted my playing outside, throwing a ball against the wall and breaking screens and doing various things. And he was more of the disciplinarian than my father was. As a matter of fact, he gave me my first spanking, and I never cried. And he wanted to continue to punish me corporally until I cried. And so a battle of wills, which I won. And when I got off his lap after being beaten, I turned to him and I said, "You're not my father. You can't do this to me." My mother, unfortunately, would tease my father about his inability to support the family, because she married into a rich family, and here she married the one son who was not prosperous and had no intention to be. I think she thought, as many of us do, she was a dreamer, and she thought that eventually, you know, as the oldest son of a burgeoning businessman, he was going to take over, and she would be secure. But that didn't mean she wanted to abandon her pianistics or her capabilities in that regard. So she took jobs, which paid very well in the Depression, because the people who traveled the Orpheum circuit were willing to pay $35 or $40 a week for an accompanist, which in the Depression was unheard of. My dad was making $22 a week in a furniture store at the lumberyard. And it filtered down to me. And my dad never struck me except once, and I deserved it. We were standing outside of my aunt's house, and he and my uncle were taking me to a ball game at Miller Park, where the Millers played in Minneapolis. And we used to love to go to those ball games with the older guys, my cousins and so on. And we were gathered around the cars that were going to take the party to the ballpark. And to be honest with you, I must have sassed him. And because he knew that my uncle hit his kids a lot, I think my dad just took it on himself to emulate that, and he smacked me across the face. And I remember my uncle saying, "You deserved it." And I the feeling I got was, hey, my dad's got some guts after all, you know? When I raised my own children, they always used to say, "Make it definite, Dad," you know. Be a little more disciplinary. I throw a ball against the wall. Not aimlessly, I keep score. Babe, it's a high towering fly. Great over the head catch, Terry. I throw a ball against a wall, hating hard grounders, especially the short hop. But when I DeRocher a backhand miracle, it takes my head off with delight. I throw a ball against a wall. I'm Hack and Rabbit and Gabby favor the poor Nationals. The underdog good guys usually win. I pretend it's all by chance, and I never drop a tough one in the clutch. I throw a ball against a wall. So many games go into extra innings. Sometimes I have to cross my eyes on an easy chance, so I drop the ball, and one team wins. I throw a ball against a wall and hope Douglas doesn't come by and ask me what I'm doing. I always have to say, "Nothing," and that's a lie. Reach out to the ice-sculpted, crystal-perfect beauties of the North, the cool unteasables. Run from the dark, tired, weeping old ways. Make disbelief and irreverence. I will not pick your overripe apples, Grandma. I will not steal over-red apples from your orchard, nor your heavy red berries from the bush, or grapes from your arbor. There are hard, green, lusty apples, sweeter, sour northern spies, and gold-green delicious Jonathans, and bursting currants and gooseberries, mouth-puckering grapes, and rhubarb to steal. Joan Johnson. Cool, sculpted, quiet, golden thing. Smile moving, pink-white fuzz on apple shiny cheeks. Are you a real Jew? Smile, fuzz white, gold glow. Somebody said you were. No? Catholic? We're Lutheran. You are? Come on, aren't you Jewish? No, Joan, really, I'm, kiss, fuzz, cheek, apple, gentle lip tickle. Please, Joan, here now. No, Joan, really, I'm half this and that. God, mouthwater, powdered sugar, fuzz, sweet apple, lip tickle, smooth head swim. Kiss a gold blonde sweet girl. My father had finally decided to go to work for my grandfather. It was the only thing he could do. My mother got him the job. She went to the uncles and said, "Look, your older brother is failing as an athlete. He's getting old. Why don't you take him into the business?" So they took him into the business, and he did menial work. But by the time the lumber yards began to prosper, and this was during the Depression, my family did very well during the Depression. For some reason, my grandfather was a genius who invented a way to put lumber into kilns that would dry the wood before it was ready, and they could buy the wood for practically nothing, and then by the time they treated it and sold it, they sold hemlock for pine, and hemlock was cheap and pine was very expensive. So they did very well, and my dad was a mathematic whiz, so they had him doing the paperwork at the lumber yards. And finally they said, we want to expand, we're going to open a lumber yard in Milwaukee. And without asking really, they assigned my father and my Uncle Morris to move to Milwaukee and open the lumberyard. That's how we moved. There came a time when my father and my uncle wanted to retire and give over the business to their children, and my uncle had 2 boys. So his was an automatic thing, and my father had no one to give it over to. So the question was my uncle going to reward my father with an equal share in cash or in some kind of stock or something? And for some reason, it never happened. And they brushed my father aside, and I was in New York by this time, and my dad had me come back one summer and asked me if I wanted to take over, and I said no. And it was at that time that I think the other side of the family plotted, and my father was suddenly retired, out of business, and semi-broke. My mother came from a Romanian group, and they were crazy. They were crazy. But my mother didn't know she was crazy because she grew up with crazy people. They were dancers, they were singers, they were poets, they were musicians like my mother. They were nuts, but I'm talking really nuts because they were abandoned by their father very early, and the mother had to bring up 8 children, 7 girls and a boy. My father's family were 6 boys and a girl. So my mother was the influence that connected me to the culture. My father wanted to connect me to the Jewish portion of that culture. But when he saw that I resisted, he gave up because my grandfather was not a punisher. He didn't say, listen, he's going to be an Orthodox and he's going to go to Cheder and so on and so forth. It didn't happen like that. And that's because my great-grandfather, Harry, was really the scion, the king of the family. And it was his idea to be godly, not religious, as it were. So my father was forgiven for eating non-kosher food in his home, forgiven for a son who was an obvious renegade and really loved to be with the Christian kids. I did, because they were freer than I was. And I remember he assembled us on the front porch to bless us before we went to Milwaukee, where my father was opening a different business. And he said to me, I know you're not going to attend shul, or synagogue, as he put it. He said, you're something of a renegade. And he was able to communicate to me in Hebrew and some kind of pidgin English, but I understood every word. And he said to me, you will take God with you in your soul wherever you go. And I became infused with a necessity to create and maintain an association with a higher power. But I did get bar mitzvahed for my great-grandfather's sake, and then I dropped the religion. I dropped it for 50 years. So we went to Milwaukee and I made new friends. I was still in high school. And here I am showing off to everybody that I can write a song. I finally wrote a song called My Baby's Got Me in a Daze, which is just terrible. And a song called Love is King. And that was kind of a cute song. So somebody said Benny Davis is coming to town. And he was a very well-known ASCAP songwriter who had written one great hit after another. I can't remember them, but anyway. This guy, Maury Belfer, takes me from my high school, and he takes me backstage and begs me into the program that Benny Davis is sponsoring for the local songwriters. And he's got a program of 4 or 5 Milwaukee songwriters, some of whom had come up from Chicago to be in this show. And he made me a late entry. And I went up on the stage and played Love is King in A-flat, and I sang 1.5 choruses. And the audience exploded. They stood up and gave me an ovation, which embarrassed the hell out of Benny Davis, because he did not want this interloper to win. He had already decided that this guy wrote the best song, and the guy did write a better song than mine. But he didn't win, I won. And he held his hand over me and over the other guy until finally, after 6 times, I could hear my girlfriend Shirley say, "This is gonna kill me." And I won. The prize was supposed to be that I go to B.F. Wood, who was a publisher in Chicago, who had written When the Red, Red Robin Comes bobbing along. And he was a publisher in Chicago, and he had an office there. And I was supposed to go down there and get my song published. Well, we were shown the door, and even the name Benny Davis or blah, blah, blah meant nothing. So that was my first disappointment. But I learned to take it in pretty good stride. My father's family truly resembled the Scandinavians. They were, after all, Lithuanian, which is right next door, especially to Estonia. All of my father's family were blue-eyed and light-complexioned. My mother's side were Romanian and very gypsy. So I had, again, that tremendous contrast. But to me, when I was a boy growing up in Minneapolis, before we actually became part of the Jewish community, I disengaged. I, first of all, had thrown out the orthodoxy of my parents. I just simply became a renegade. I really wanted to be an Indian, but that didn't go. And then the next people who were the majority were the Lutheran Swedes. And boy, how I wanted to be one of them. In time, I came to realize that my roots were pretty wonderful. And while I had thrown God out with the bathwater, in recovering God, I still eschewed orthodoxy in its ritualistic aspect. But their interpretation of life and living according to the Old Testament rang true. Slowly but surely, I came to realize that their moralistics, when practiced becomingly and modestly, were the way I wanted to live out the rest of my life. I don't know what I was foundering as I was as an agnostic, because every time I was inspired, I knew where it came from. Had to come from a superpower. And that superpower I couldn't call anything but God. My mother was almost given to the purpose of sponsoring my gift, as she called it. And one of the things she wanted me to do was play the piano, because she had this idea that someday I might want to be a pianist or use it for some purpose. And I did not respond very well. She sent me to classical pianist teachers, and they bored me, and so did the repertory. But finally, she had this wonderful thought that maybe somebody could shortcut me into it. And she sent me to a man by the name of Stanley Keyes in Minneapolis. Stanley Keyes found out I was lazy and I wasn't going to learn how to play piano. So he taught me the guitar symbols, or in those days, as they were printed in the sheet music, they were called the ukulele passages. And for some reason, I took to them immediately. And I was able to use them to accompany myself to sing songs, and later to use them to write songs, which I did in order to impress women or young girls in high school. I'd write an original song, and they'd put me up on the stage to do them in the auditorium, and I was the hero. I wasn't the football captain like I wanted to be, but I was the singing entertainer and so forth. But you know, my mother became what I later called the Aunt Tilly syndrome. With my students, I said, there's always somebody in your family that overappreciates your capabilities. Now just forget Aunt Tilly and how she is enthralled by your writing, and let's get to work here. Well, that's what I had to do with myself, because my mother was overpoweringly supportive, for which really I never gave her thanks properly, but I'm doing it now. I was able to go to the University of Wisconsin, which I entered at the age of about 16 and a half, because they kept skipping me in the early years. So I was much too young to appreciate higher education. I was a mediocre student, just getting by on my wits, as it were, and bull sessions before tests, all throughout my freshman year. But I was in a fraternity by that time of a whole bunch of intellectual kids who were super attainers, A students. And, you know, it's hard to rub elbows with these guys that are bringing home grades while I'm bringing home C's and an occasional B. Against my will, my fraternity brothers pushed me into extracurricular activities that had to do with writing songs for shows that the Harrisfoot Club took on the road. I starred in those things and wrote songs for those things. And I was June West in one of 30 Days Hotter Than Mae West in a play. And some of the people who wrote the Harrisfoot shows in those days became very big names in show business. One of whom was my own fraternity brother, David Susskind, who later appears in my life as one of my sponsors when I become a songwriter in New York. For some reason, I wanted to reject my musical side, because there still was this infantile need to be my father. I wanted to be him. He was so strong and so fleet and so handsome, and so he had such a, even as cold as he was, he had a fantastic personality and a great dry sense of humor. And my mother was more loquacious and extroverted, and my father was very reserved. And my father's family were all very dignified people. My goodness, you would have thought they were the Rothschilds. They wanted to, you know, grow in their estate as haves instead of have-nots in America with great dignity. And they never showed off their wealth. And there was something wonderful about that. I wanted to be that. But all this time I was this bouncing, extroverted, silly kid. I gave it one more shot to be my father. I played football. At the University of Wisconsin, I weighed 129 pounds. I'm 5'4", and I'm going out for football. And these behemoths. So in a punting practice, the coach said, "I'm not going to use you for contact, for God's sakes." He says, you can field punts and we'll run them back, but it's not contact. Just make a pattern of receptions. So I caught the punts, and one day, this was in the second half of my freshman year, I'm going for the sidelines and two ends are coming down at me, and I try to cut in and split them, which would have made my coach very proud. And my father, wherever he was at the time, back in Milwaukee. And my knee went this way, and my body went this way, and it just tore everything, my cartilage in my right knee, which blew up to the size of a watermelon. And they took me to the hospital, and they had to drain it, and finally I got my operation. During this time, I began to value being in the college and forget about athletics. I'm not going to be my father. And I had written a Harrisfoot show when I was a freshman. And so, you know, destiny forced me over to the music side, but I'm still in total rejection of it. Well, what was my alternative to the music investment? Academics. It was a total escape from the travail of my father's pursuit and my mother's. So now I wasn't pleasing them, I was pleasing myself and the image I had of my great-grandfather, whom I revered, secretly. I didn't want my music. I was abandoned by circumstance from my pursuit of my father's image. So there was only one left to me, and that was to become a scholar like my great-grandfather on the porch in Minneapolis, because he was a scholar. And when I talk about an Orthodox scholar, I mean he knew everything in the Old Testament, word for word, passage by passage, with his tefillin and his phylacteries that he wore on the porch all the time, and he was praying. Now at last, God was telling me I wasn't going to be the athlete that I wanted to be to emulate my father. I wanted to stay in school forever. I thought I'd be a professor of political science, for which I did not have a gift. But I could exert my mental powers. I had something of an IQ, I guess. And it was a winner for me to bring home good grades. And my sister, incidentally, got straight A's all the way through. Could have made Phi Beta Kappa if she had finished Wisconsin. So we'd had good genes, you know, but jumbled genes. Is that a good song title? I come from jumbled genes. As a result of this cardilectomy, I was refused by the military, and I also went to California because my mother's ambition overcame us, and she wanted me to be a songwriter, and she gave me New York or California to go to, but we had relatives in California, so she sent me to California. I lived with my relatives, and finally I just broke down. I got pneumonia, and I moved out of my cousin's house. And I moved into a little place, and my dad sent me about $25 a week to pay for rent and so forth and food. And I sat and played solitaire for a year. And I'm faking it. I'm telling my parents, I saw so-and-so, and he said he's going to take me to Paramount, and I'm going to see a guy at Fox. Big liar I am. But what I'm trying to do is break the umbilicals with both of my parents. And I hated the music business. Right away, I found people in the music business that were loathsome to me. They had no aesthetic appeal. They had no aesthetic boiling points. They were businessmen. They were bean counters, even in those days. So if I saw a guy at a publishing company, he wanted to know what I had that was marketable. If I sat down at the piano, he'd interrupt me after 8 bars. If it was something he couldn't sell, get out of here, kid. Jesus, you know. And then a college fraternity brother of mine, Boris Steinberg, called me up one day. And he said, he was in Los Angeles for one reason or another. And he had a 1937 Ford, which was a thunderbolt of a car. It was way ahead of its time. It could go 110 miles an hour. And he said, I'm going to go back to Chicago, where he lived. He said, I'll take you back to Chicago with me. I said, I'll go. Packed up. I had one suitcase, threw it in his trunk. And we got in the car, and we drove to Yuma, Arizona. And dare I tell about being a bad boy? Well, I had never been to a house of ill repute in my life, and he took me to my first one in Yuma, Arizona. I didn't enjoy that either. The girls reminded me of the daughters of the professional managers of the music companies. They were that cold and unenthused. Then we drove all the way through New Mexico into the panhandle of Texas. And we got off at El Paso, and I had run out of money completely. And I remember wiring my father from a hotel in El Paso, and my dad sent me back a telegraphed check for $50. And immediately, Bori and I went over to Juarez on the other side. And again, I went to the second of my ill repute. And it was a Mexican girl, and she was very tender with me. And that was kind of a nice little adventure. And then we sped through Oklahoma, and going 90 miles an hour, one of the tires went, and there was a bridge in front of us with stanchions of steel, and we're going like this, swaying from side to side on the road. And he straightened it out and got over the bridge before we zonked. And then he looked in the trunk, and there was my grip and his grip, but he had no jack. So he went up to a farmhouse, and two farm boys came out, and they lifted the car and held it until he could change the tire. From Chicago, I called my folks and I said, I've got to come to Milwaukee because they ain't taking me in Chicago. So my folks said, come on. And I had just enough money out of the 50 to take a train to Milwaukee. And I really wanted to rusticate there because my folks lived in a suburb in a nice little house. And I had the dormer room, which was in the attic. And there was a piano in the living room. And things started over again. When I came home to Milwaukee, my mother really, again, took me over and said, tell me about California, blah, blah, blah. And I told her fairy tales about how close I came to success. And it got her terribly excited. So she said to me, I want you to go to New York. And I want you to seriously take up the music business. So she went to an attorney in Milwaukee by the name of Robert Hess, who was one of the hired people by ASCAP to log the performances of ASCAP music in the Midwest. And he had connections in New York, and he said, well, if you're going to go to New York, I'll send you to Marx, and I'll send you to Mills, and a couple of the publishers. So my mother got excited, and blah, blah, blah. And a young Polish guy, Liberace, was playing in the Plankington Arcade. So just before I left Wisconsin to go to New York to be a songwriter again and ignore my college training, I got a job in the Plankington Arcade playing when Liberace didn't. And then a friend of mine by the name of Wilbur Rice used to drop in and sing with me because I couldn't play melody, so we were singing all the time. And I really hated the job. So I begged my mother not to send me to New York, but to send me back to school. So I went back to school, and I was a waiter at my own fraternity house. That got me my food. My folks sent me a little bit of money, and that's when I began to pursue the academic and stayed in Wisconsin from 1936 to 1940, when I was supposed to have graduated. But you see, I had taken the year off, so now I needed one more year at the university. So I stayed through 41 while the war was being fought. And I started to work on two things at once, getting my undergraduate degree, and I started to work on my master's on the side, just to keep busy academically and not do anything musical or athletic. I had one particular teacher in creative writing. His name was Gray, Professor Gray. God, I'll never forget that. And the first assignment I got in creative writing was, he told us to take an article out of the newspaper, or take the one he was going to read to us, and bring us back a short story based on that. And he read this one about a guy who was arrested for stealing money or something of value off a ship or something. I forget what it was. And I went home, and I remember how eager I was to write it. And I started way back of that, where this guy had been a worker on the ship of the lowest degree, a seaman. And he had an idea that he wanted to get on land and stay there. He did not want to stay on ship. So he jumped ship, but before he jumped ship, he stole something out of the captain's cabin. Let's call it a necklace or a bracelet or a watch or whatever it was, because he needed some funds. And my story said, when he got on land, he finally got to be a better person, and he prospered a little bit. And it was in his attempt to return this article that he was apprehended, putting it back, and then he was jailed. And my professor has all of these 31 or 32 Blue Book examples of the short story extrapolations. And he said, now I'm going to read one of these that I consider exceptional. I'm going to ask the student who wrote this not to reveal himself. So I sat in my seat, and he started to read my story. And I puffed up like I was a peacock. And he asked a question. And whose hand do you think shot up in the air and answered the question? I did. And he looked at me like, you bastard. Anyway, I had tried to reveal to my schoolmates that I was the guy who wrote this wonderful thing. Well, later on, Gray forgave me for that and gave me special assignments, which he then mailed to various publishing houses, especially poetic passages that I wrote, which he wasn't teaching, but he appreciated. And then he invited me to his home. I was so special. He invited me to his home, which was very close to Taliesin, and he's the one who took me over there and told me the whole story of Frank Lloyd Wright, and what a magnificent story that was. And he encouraged me to be a writer. And that had never occurred to me, except I told him about my songwriting, and he poo-pooed it. Said, no, he said, I think you should work on narrative and poetry. So I hated to get out of his class, but it only lasted 1 year. And I probably turned out about 8 or 9 things, and we had nibbles, but I didn't get published, as it were. And in the meantime, I had to have a major and a minor, so I took my major in American history and my minor in political science. To Gray's disgust, he said, you're going the wrong way. He said, you should take English and music. I wish I'd listened to him. I formulated a 15 club of all the guys in Milwaukee who were pals. And we were 15 guys, and we formed a 15 club, emulating the Minneapolis chapter of the 15 club, which I'd been in as a 16-year-old, so I guess. And these guys, again, appreciated anything that anybody could do creatively. So they helped me with getting back into athletics, and they helped me in my music without raving about it or making me prove anything. So I began to get a kind of a natural attitude about using what Gray called my gift. Professor Gray was still my guru, and I used to meet with him and have meals with him. He was the first to bring to my attention that I was gifted. See, this I hadn't heard. He said, "You're a creative person and you're doing uncreative work like I do," he said. "Don't be me." He said, "I'm a professor." And for years and years, all I've ever thought about is, why wasn't I a great writer? Now I see a great writer in front of me, and he's wasting it. After an interview with Gray, I returned to Milwaukee, and the draft board passed me as a 4F because of my knee and my polio. I went to work in a factory to produce the Oerlikon Ack guns that became active in the Merchant Marine, and it was a 2-year struggle for me to go to work 12 hours a day and 10 hours on Saturday. That's 70 hours a week for $70 a week. And so after 2 years of that, I just gave in to my mother. My mother gave me $80, and I went to New York.
Dreams return like birds in flight to light a flame that burns through every night. While memories stay right through each day and linger in my mind, they play the harmonies that we once knew.